Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a heady stack of sources, articles, policy papers, some deep economic analysis, and we're going to try and give you the distilled insight.
We are.
And the waters today are, well, they're particularly turbulent.
Yeah.
We're looking at the structural, the financial, and I guess the philosophical currents that are really ripping through the heart of the European Union right now.
Indeed. And the sources we've got in front of us, I mean, they are not mincing words at all.
No.
The analysts we reviewed, they're working with this really profound level of pessimism. Some are suggesting that Europe has almost no future if it stays on its current path.
Which is a shocking thing to read.
It is. They're saying there's, and I'm quoting here, very little room left to turn the tide.
Wow.
And that level of alarm, I mean, that tells you we're looking at something far beyond just your standard political squabbles or, cyclical economic dip.
Okay, let's pivot from that general observation because that is a shocking hook. Let's get into the specifics.
Yeah.
So let's unpack this. We're used to hearing about the resilience, the strength of the EU. But the material we've got here suggests a fundamental crisis of confidence. And it's being driven by what they call core policy flaws that are actively harming the bloc.
Exactly. And you mentioned this pessimism. It stems from these compounding financial and political challenges. We're talking about deep, structural, you could even argue existential problems.
Existential.
Yeah, that challenge the very foundation of the whole European project. And I think this deep dive is so necessary because the public conversation, it often just focuses on the surface level stuff, right?
Like the daily headlines.
But these sources, they're pointing to systemic design errors.
So our mission for you then is clear. We need to understand why these policies, which, are often sold to the public as progressive and necessary, are causing such extreme alarm.
And what these specific accounting problems are.
Yes, exactly. What are these accounting problems that are driving this very real debate about the future of European democracy?
Precisely. And we'll be navigating through three, I think, interconnected spheres today.
Okay.
First, the economic miscalculations that are sort of underpinning the massive Green Deal.
Right.
Second, the regulatory overreach. We see that in new digital surveillance proposals and this erosion of national legal authority.
And third.
And finally, the geopolitical contradictions, specifically around the financial and military support for Ukraine. It all ties together.
But there are a lot to get through. Let's start right at the top then, with the economic centerpiece of the previous European Commission.
The Green Deal.
The Green Deal, spearheaded by Franz Timmermans, and its a partner strategy, the digital decade. These were billed as the flagships for the continent's future.
Absolutely, the Great Recovery.
Yeah.
And financed largely by those immense COVID recovery funds. And this is where the core of the problem lies, according to our sources. These huge programs, I mean, we're talking billions in spending, massive regulatory change. They're rooted in what are described as gigantic calculation errors. Yeah, gigantic calculation errors, not just small mistakes.
No, and they're built around what the papers call harmful components that are already, they're already manifesting in the real economy.
Okay, so this isn't theoretical. The sources are saying the damage is active.
It's active. An active collapse in key sectors.
So how are these errors actually showing up? I mean, let's ground this for everyone listening.
Well, you don't have to look much further than the biggest economy in the bloc, Germany.
Okay.
The specific example that's cited over and over again in this analysis is Germany's their energy transition strategy.
Right, the energy transition.
The political decision was made to simultaneously phase out two stable, reliable sources of what's called baseload power.
Coal and nuclear power plants.
Both at the same time.
And the replacement for that was supposed to be, what? Wind and solar? Wind and solar. Intermittent power. They relied so heavily on this promised wind power capacity that it hasn't been built yet.
So the plan ran ahead of the engineering.
Way ahead, not even at the scale needed to replace the lost megawatts. One of the sources describes it really vividly as throwing away your old shoes before you have new ones.
That's a powerful image.
It's an act of really political self-sabotage. It prioritizes an ideal timeline over engineering reality.
And that seems like a recipe for catastrophic failure in a modern industrial economy.
It is.
I mean, if you get rid of your reliable baseload energy, your 2047 power, without immediate robust replacements, what happens to your big industries? Steel, chemicals, car manufacturing.
The consequence is twofold, and it's immediate. First, energy becomes unreliable. It's subject to the wind not blowing or the sun not shining.
Right.
And second, it becomes prohibitively unaffordable, or often both.
And when your core industrial energy costs just skyrocket.
Industry stops being competitive on a global scale. It's that simple. The analysts we reviewed, they are not mincing words here. They're claiming these fundamental errors have already broken the industrial heart of Europe.
Broken it.
Yes, manufacturers are now making these incredibly difficult choices. They either shut down, they scale back their operations, or, and this is the crucial part, they relocate.
So where?
To places like the United States or Asia, where energy prices can be, a quarter of what they're paying in Europe.
So we are not talking about just some minor economic pain here. This is potentially permanent deindustrialization, driven by a policy choice.
Precisely. And this devastating critique of the Green Deal's execution, it leads us to a really key question.
Which is?
If the accounting was so clearly flawed and the economic consequences were so foreseeable, why was this pushed through with such haste and such political force?
Okay, so let's pivot from the economic fallout to the political agenda. You're saying the timing is critical here. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the sources don't just critique the execution. They critique the very origins and the timing of these massive policies. So walk us through the evidence that this whole plan actually predates the pandemic.
Well, the argument is it's highly provocative. It says these massive plans were basically ready to go long before COVID started.
And the crisis was just a convenient excuse.
It was the political vehicle to push it through. That's the phrase they use. If you look at the political calendar, the Green Deal, the digital decade, they were fully prepared and adopted in the summer of 2019.
Summer of 2019, so immediately after the EU elections.
Exactly.
But why that rush? Why then?
It's because of the bureaucracy of the EU itself. The new budget cycle, that big 7-year financial framework.
The one from 2021 to 2027.
That's the one. It requires consensus on the financial plans and the regulatory scope in the 2 years before it starts.
To avoid vetoes or crippling political battles later on.
Exactly. The Commission needed to get political consensus before the formal budget period even began.
Okay. And then, early 2020, the pandemic hits.
Mm-hmm.
So how is that crisis then leveraged?
The documents were, they were simply re-edited. They were given what the sources call a virus jacket.
A virus jacket.
Yeah. And the proof cited for this is an open letter from Commission President von der Leyen and Vice President Timmermans. It's dated December 10th, 2019.
December 10th.
And it explicitly links these huge, ambitious plans to the then nascent epidemic that had just started in Wuhan.
Wait a minute. They linked the Green Deal to the Wuhan virus in December 2019.
They did. And the argument is the sheer volume of this stuff. Thousands of pages of detailed legislation for the Green Deal and digital decade.
Covering everything from building standards to farming?
Everything. It couldn't possibly have been written between, say, February and May of 2020.
No way.
So the source argues this proves they were long-planned documents that were just strategically repackaged. The pandemic provided the moral and political cover. The emergency footing.
The emergency footing needed to ram through a massive increase in shared debt.
And centralized power, the Eurobonds, something that had been politically impossible for years.
So the crisis wasn't the cause of the policy, it was the political lever to overcome any democratic hurdles or potential vetoes. That's a staggering claim about political opportunism.
In the flawed reasoning, it didn't just stop at the energy grid. We should deep dive into one specific and highly controversial part of this, the farm-to-fork strategy.
Okay, farm-to-fork. It was a central piece of the Green Deal's biodiversity strategy, right?
It was.
So tell us about its practical aims. What was it designed to do?
Well, the practical aim, according to the documents themselves, was explicitly to reduce agricultural output in Europe.
Reduce it.
Yes. The policy included targets like reducing the number of farmers by 10%, which they projected would result in a mandatory 12% drop in overall food production inside the EU.
A 12% drop in one of the world's most productive agricultural regions. That's massive.
It's huge.
So what was the stated intention there? Why reduce Europe's food supply? Was it environmental, like cutting nitrogen runoff?
That was the veneer, yes. Reducing nitrogen and pesticide use. But the justification they used went, deeper and frankly a lot more speculative.
How so?
The core reasoning was based on an unproven assumption that was circulating in some policy circles at the time.
Okay.
The assumption that the virus originated from nature being overturned by nitrogen pollution. Something about a sick bat flying into a lab near Wuhan.
Seriously. That was the basis.
Based on this very complex and, highly speculative chain of events, the logical policy step for Brussels was deemed to be significantly reducing agriculture and nitrogen output in Europe.
That seems like an extraordinary leap from a fringe epidemiological theory to a continent-wide farm policy.
It is.
But let's follow the consequences. If you intentionally reduce the global food supply, prices go up. I mean, it's basic economics. Did the policy documents account for that?
They did. And this is the shocking part. The documents themselves suggested that this intentional reduction in European output, which, remember, often feeds global markets, it would push an estimated 17 million people into food insecurity.
17 million.
And the greatest impact was expected to fall on the most vulnerable populations, specifically the poor in Africa, particularly the Horn of Africa, who rely heavily on affordable grain exports.
Hold on. You're saying the policy documents predicted this? They accepted that this reduction would cause food insecurity for millions. That seems unbelievable.
They accepted it as a direct consequence of meeting their targets. The sources are really clear on this. The internal analysis knew that reduced supply would increase prices, and they knew the poorest nations would feel that pain most acutely.
So it wasn't about wishing for disaster.
No, it's about pursuing one goal, in this case, nitrogen reduction, so relentlessly that acknowledged mass poverty becomes an acceptable side effect. The policymakers were aware of the human cost, and yet they proceeded.
That is a powerful indictment of the priorities within the Commission. What was the international reaction to this calculated trade-off?
Well, the most telling critique actually came from a highly impartial external source, the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Under the Biden administration.
Yes, so this wasn't some politically polarized attack. It was just basic economic modeling done by 6 USDA economists.
And what was their conclusion?
Their findings confirmed what, basic supply and demand economics would predict, that reduced supply would lead to significant inflation in global food prices. Specifically, they modeled an average of 12% more expensive food globally.
With devastating spikes in vulnerable areas.
Exactly. They confirmed the greatest impact would fall on poor nations that rely on these commodity markets. And the source really critiques the EU Commission's internal claim that higher prices shouldn't be the intention of the policy.
What do they call it?
Nothing more than wishful thinking that just ignores confirmed economic reality.
So, to recap this part, the EU created a law based on tenuous scientific speculation, ignored basic economic logic that was confirmed by impartial economists, and pushed through a policy that its own projections showed would demonstrably hurt the world's most vulnerable people.
Yes.
This perfectly encapsulates those gigantic calculation errors you mentioned at the start. It shows policy being driven by ideology, not by math or verifiable impact assessments.
And it connects right back to that original critique. The entire reasoning of the Green Deal is deemed weak. The mathematical and accounting underpinnings are simply incorrect, and yet the policy path remains fixed.
And this refusal to acknowledge the real-world economic pain is why that pessimism about industrial collapse is so acute.
It is.
Okay, so this economic fragility from flawed policy, it immediately bleeds into political resentment, right?
Of course.
The economic damage from the Green Deal drives industry away, but then the political overreach, that feeling of a centralized state overriding local needs, that just amplifies the democratic frustration. So we have to understand how the EU Commission legally manages to seize power over issues that should belong to national governments. How do they violate that core principle of subsidiarity?
This is where we get into the legal engineering. It's designed specifically to bypass democratic checks. And the most contentious recent example is the proposed legislation known as chat control.
Chat control.
Or the mandate for the mandatory scanning of all internet traffic for child sexual abuse material, or CSAM.
Okay, that immediately sounds like a direct clash with national constitutional law and jurisdiction.
It is, explicitly. Policing, criminal investigation, the protection of civil liberties like the secrecy of your correspondence. These are fundamentally national domains.
They're governed by that principle of subsidiarity.
Right, which demands that laws should be made at the lowest, most local level possible.
So the national parliament, not Brussels.
Unless there's a compelling, legally defined reason for EU action.
So what was the Commission's initial public justification for trying this, this massive overreach?
They gave 2. First, the undeniable fact that CSAM is a cross-border crime and it needs international cooperation. That's true, of course.
And the second?
The second was far more politically loaded. The commissioner, Ylva Johansson, claimed that the overwhelming majority of Dutch people wanted this sweeping law.
And the sources say?
They call that specific claim 100% falsified propaganda.
Falsified. How was the public opinion falsified?
It all comes down to the question they asked in the poll.
Ah.
If you ask a citizen, do you want to fight child abuse? The answer will always be an emotional, universal, yes, absolutely.
Of course.
But that question is deliberately leading. It completely conceals the actual implementation, which is, do you want all your private communications, every encrypted message, every personal email, every photo you send to your spouse, to be scanned and potentially opened by algorithms?
Or worse, by private company contractors.
Exactly. So that's the core conflict. You have this noble goal of protecting children on one side,
versus the constitutional right to privacy and secrecy of correspondence on the other. In Dutch law, it's briefgeheim, for example.
And that leads us directly to the unintended consequences, because if we listen to the actual professionals in this field,
the police themselves,
the Zederecherche, the sexual crimes investigators in the Netherlands, they're quoted in the source material as saying they do not actually need total universal surveillance.
Why not? I would have thought more data would always be better for them.
They argue the opposite. They say total scanning generates way too much noise, too many false positives.
Right.
Imagine trying to find a needle in a continent-sized haystack where 99.9% of the straw is just normal, benign communication, but the system keeps flagging it as potentially problematic.
It would just overwhelm their already limited resources.
Completely. What they say they need is more staff, higher salaries to attract specialized investigators, and crucially, better cross-border coordination using the tools they already have.
And one of those targeted tools you mentioned is the hashing database system. How does that work compared to blanket surveillance?
Hashing is elegant. It's targeted. It means you assign a unique, non-reversible digital code, a hash, to a known, existing harmful image.
Okay.
So if a criminal is caught with a known piece of material in, say, Portugal, the police can use that hash code to scan national databases and quickly identify associated criminals in Germany or Sweden.
So it targets known material and specific people.
Yes, it dramatically lightens the burden on investigators who currently have to manually review just horrific, traumatic evidence. Chat control, on the other hand, it forces the scanning of unknown content. It violates the constitutional rights of everyone in Europe on the off chance it might catch something new.
Which confirms this deep concern about the constitutional breach.
Mm-hmm.
The violation of privacy, the secrecy of correspondence, these are enshrined in national constitutions and the European Charter of Human Rights. And on top of that, you have the police, the parliament, and the public, all largely against this measure.
The democratic defiance is very well documented. The source mentions a counterpoll. It was organized by Patrick Breyer, a German Green MEP, and himself a survivor of child abuse.
And what did his poll find?
That poll, which asked citizens directly about the surveillance measures, showed a resounding 72% of Dutch citizens across all age groups were against this sweeping measure.
72%. And the Dutch parliament.
The Tweede-Kamer, they were also against it.
Okay, so you've got widespread democratic opposition, professional law enforcement skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
How then does the EU Commission, in the face of all that resistance, justify forcing a law on a domain it technically has no jurisdiction over?
Yeah.
This legal bypass.
Right.
This feels like the key takeaway for everyone listening.
This is the critical insight. It's how the EU bypasses subsidiarity using the internal market rationale.
The internal market.
Specifically, Article 33 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. The rationale is, it's ingenious, it's utterly cynical, and it's utterly effective in seizing power.
Okay, lay out the legal gymnastics for us.
So the Commission argues that having different national laws on scanning traffic, so France requires one type of scan, Denmark forbids it, and so on, this creates high compliance costs for big tech companies.
For your Facebooks, your Googles, your X.
Exactly. They have to hire these expensive armies of lawyers and compliance officers just to navigate 27 different regulatory landscapes.
Which is, I mean, a legitimate cost of doing multinational business.
It is, but the EU turns this operational cost into a legal mechanism for federal control. And the creative conclusion is this. By creating one single, generic, and very harsh EU-wide law chat control.
They dramatically lower the administrative costs for these American billionaires.
Yes. They argue it boosts the operational profits of big tech on the European internal market.
And that's the hook.
That financial hook lowering compliance costs to boost big tech profits, that becomes the legal justification for the EU to assert control over what are traditionally national police and justice matters.
Wow. So they're essentially trading away fundamental constitutional rights for lower legal bills for Silicon Valley. The internal market, which was designed to help trade goods and services, is being weaponized to enforce standardized surveillance.
The entire ethical discussion is just reduced to a commercial calculation. And this pattern, it's not an isolated incident. The sources argue it's the new standard operating procedure. You can see it again in the creation of the European Health Dataspace.
The European Health Dataspace, what are the parallels here?
Well, the system is designed to create a mechanism where your confidential medical data, everything from your blood test results to private conversations with your doctor, is standardized, stored centrally, and made tradable.
Tradable.
Yes, regardless of whether you, the patient, actually consent to it being sold.
And what's the jurisdiction hook they're using there?
Profit. Again, the rationale is that this massive trove of standardized data can be anonymized and sold. Sold to American data trading companies, pharmaceutical researchers, insurance firms. The explicit potential for earning money, framed as maximizing Europe's assets, that's the asserted reason the EU is claiming jurisdiction over national healthcare policy.
So the rights of a patient to say, no, you can't sell my personal medical data, are weakened.
Because Europe has deemed that data a commercial asset to be exploited under the banner of the internal market.
The conclusion here is just staggering. Every single critical ethical discussion, policing, privacy, national healthcare, is being systematically reduced to what the source calls a stupid commercial sales pitch.
That's the phrase.
Financial considerations, framed as market harmonization, are consistently trumping constitutional rights and local democratic needs.
And this constant bypassing of democratic checks and balances, this is the root cause of that crisis of confidence we started with.
Right.
When citizens and local politicians see their rights being undermined just to maximize the profits of big tech or to assert central authority, the level of distrust just skyrockets. It breeds the deep-seated polarization that threatens the coherence of the entire project.
Okay, let's transition now from those internal policy flaws to external conflict. Because how does this lack of fundamental unity and financial honesty manifest on the world stage? Specifically, let's talk about the conflict in Ukraine. The sources suggest there's a profound and frankly tragic paradox in the West's military support strategy.
The paradox is that the West's policy objective is inherently contradictory. And that contradiction is leading to a disastrous status quo.
What is that contradiction?
The sources contend that the unspoken but agreed upon strategy is that Ukraine must neither lose decisively to Russia, nor be allowed to become strong enough to achieve a clear military victory or threaten Russian territory.
So a managed stalemate, and this calculated hesitation has created what on the ground?
A devastating multi-year frozen front line. It's a strategy that's designed for prolonged stalemate, not for victory. And it has a horrific humanitarian cost.
The loss of life.
The loss of life, the profound trauma, the collapse of economic potential for an entire generation of Ukrainian men.
So what at its core is driving this careful balancing act? What's preventing the West from just going all in?
In a word, fear. The analysts are unanimous on this. The core issue is the fear of a Russian nuclear counterreaction.
Right.
Russia is a nuclear power. And the sources stress that a conventional war fought directly against a nuclear power is fundamentally unwinnable in the traditional sense.
That military calculus changes everything, doesn't it?
It does. It's illustrated perfectly by an analogy one source uses. Imagine two people fighting with, common objects, cups, pins, chairs.
Okay.
But both combatants know they are each holding 50 or even just 2 functional hand grenades. As long as the fight remains below that threshold of existential threat, it stays conventional.
But if one side pushes the other to the brink,
the nuclear threat changes the entire calculus. The West is terrified of being the one to hand the opponent the trigger to pull the pin.
And the military support that's being provided, it reflects this caution. It's designed to keep the conflict contained.
Absolutely. The support is constantly critiqued as being too little, too late.
How so?
Well, if the West truly intended for Ukraine to achieve a clear...
only to return home and slash their own military budgets.
And then offer Ukraine military hand-me-downs or weapons that take a decade to arrive. It is a politically convenient but militarily disastrous strategy of managed defeat.
So beyond military aid, The internal financial spat over funding for Ukraine is another critical test of European unity, specifically this conflict over frozen Russian assets. What stands out to you here in terms of the bloc's financial integrity?
The fundamental disagreement over confiscation. The situation involves approximately 185 billion in Russian central bank assets.
And these are currently frozen.
Yes, we have to stress that. They are frozen, not confiscated, and they're sitting at European clearinghouses, primarily Euroclear, which is based in Belgium.
And Euroclear is in a strange position here, right? They're making huge profits from this.
They are. Because the principal is frozen, Euroclear is legally obliged to manage it, to invest it. And the interest and dividends generated by that euro 185 billion principal, well, that's currently being skimmed by Euroclear itself.
So they're making billions in unanticipated profits.
Multi-billion euro profits, just by holding on to assets that are politically untouchable.
And the EU's proposed move is to just seize the principal itself.
Yes. The EU wants to move past freezing and actually confiscate the 185 billion and transfer it directly to Ukraine for reconstruction.
But there's a catch.
The catch is the EU is pushing Belgium, where Euroclear is legally domiciled, to take this step alone and thus bear all the primary legal and financial risk.
And other major EU countries are unwilling to join Belgium in this.
They are not.
So why is confiscation so legally dangerous for Belgium?
Because it sets a massive international precedent. Central bank assets have traditionally been considered sacrosanct under international law.
So if peace ever comes.
Or, if the action is successfully challenged in an international court, Euroclear, and by extension the Belgian state, would be liable to repay those billions to Russia.
Which could jeopardize Belgium's entire financial stability.
It could, and the Belgian government has pointed this out. They've asked why, if everyone is expressing solidarity, the other 26 member states won't share the liability for what is a collective political action.
And this debate, it introduced a really compelling counterargument from a leading economist.
Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel laureate. He argued forcefully against immediate confiscation, and what's fascinating is his focus is on long-term strategy and financial stability, not just short-term political gain.
So what's his argument? Why keep the money frozen?
Stiglitz believes that in a future peace deal, Russia will inevitably owe a massive amount in war reparations to Ukraine, likely far more than 185 billion.
So the frozen assets should be retained as leverage.
Exactly, not as a quick source of cash. If the assets are retained, they could be written off against Russia's future reparations debt. They could act as a crucial down payment on the final peace accord.
And confiscating them now?
It preempts the possibility of demanding large-scale reparations later. By seizing this money now, the West might actually be letting Russia settle its final bill far too cheaply, and in the process, potentially collapsing the entire international system that governs central bank asset safety.
So the inability to even agree on this confiscation plan, despite all the constant declarations of having Ukraine's back, it really highlights the weakness of European unity when real fiscal risk is involved.
It shows that the unity is superficial. It's a fig leaf, as the source calls it. The financial contradiction is just glaring.
How so?
If the goal is truly humanitarian rebuilding bombed hospitals, infrastructure, energy grids, the financial mechanism is simple and direct.
The EU could just raise funds from its own budget.
Or institute a small, direct, EU-wide tax. For example, the sources suggested a minimal contribution, maybe €20 per month per citizen across the bloc. That would generate massive, direct, and legally clean funds.
And yet they refuse to agree on direct funding.
Because direct EU taxation is politically toxic in many capitals. So instead, they engage in these legal and verbal acrobatics, trying to find loopholes to seize frozen money, or blaming Belgium for the risk.
And the source concludes
That the failure to agree on even a minimal direct contribution proves that, to the politicians in Brussels and certain capitals, the Ukrainians are not worth €20.
And that just exposes the deep fracture between the political rhetoric and the actual fiscal commitment.
And feeds the cynicism about Europe's role on the world stage.
This whole deep dive, it reveals a consistent structural pattern. Major policy isn't being implemented through transparent democratic debate and consensus.
No.
Instead, whether it's the Green Deal, chat control, funding Ukraine, political agendas are being pushed through using these financial and commercial backdoor mechanisms.
The internal market hook, or the mobilization of common debt through a manufactured crisis.
Right. And that synthesis brings us back to the fundamental structural flaw at the heart of the European currency project itself, the Eurobond paradox.
Yes. We can't understand the current instability without revisiting how the euro was designed.
So the euro has always been politically controversial, but what makes its financial structure fundamentally paradoxical? You said even impossible.
The structure is defined by the Maastricht Treaty, specifically Article 125, which enshrines the principle of no bailout.
No bailout.
It demands a currency union and economic convergence, but it strictly forbids the two things you need for a functioning currency: a common debt structure and a common finance ministry.
And why was that strict prohibition put in place?
It was primarily driven by the insistence of fiscally conservative nations, like Germany, who were terrified of being permanently liable for the debts of, shall we say, less disciplined members.
So in essence, the treaty establishes a single currency, but mandates that it can't cost money through shared liability.
They created a currency union without the fiscal union you need to sustain it during a major downturn. They build a single currency house without a shared financial foundation or a common insurance policy.
Which is structurally impossible.
Precisely. And this impossibility forces the EU to rely on crises. The 2008 financial crisis, the 2020 pandemic. They use these moments to introduce the necessary common debt mechanisms, the Eurobonds.
And these are often introduced under false pretenses.
Yes, like being explicitly for funding healthcare heroes during the pandemic, when in reality the money often goes to long-term pre-existing projects entirely unrelated to immediate healthcare needs.
Like funding Italian building improvements.
Or other objectives aligned with that pre-existing Green Deal agenda.
And this deception, especially coming from national leaders, it just feeds the political instability and that crisis of confidence we started with.
It does, because the voters are inconsistent and the politicians are deceptive. You look at surveys. The source cites that 72% of Dutch citizens, for example, want to stay in the euro.
Right.
But they simultaneously reject the introduction of higher European taxes or permanent Eurobonds. They want the benefits of stability and open trade without accepting the fundamental fiscal integration required to make that union structurally sound.
And that contradiction is the impossibility at the core of the financial structure.
It is.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? The sources we've looked at today, they paint a pretty grim picture. Core policy tools, the Green Deal, chat control, the use of Eurobonds, they are not built on sound math or economic reality or genuine democratic will.
No, they're built on the constant attempt to circumvent democratic decision-making.
Through these creative financial justifications and commercial sales pitches, often benefiting large external corporations or fulfilling a pre-planned ideological agenda.
And that constant deception, particularly from leaders like Mark Rutte in the Netherlands, who promised no Central European taxation but then went to Brussels and agreed to it, that fuels immense distrust and polarization.
When the public realizes that pre-planned agendas are being forced through using emergencies as a smokescreen, they lose faith in the entire process.
And that leads directly back to the extreme pessimism we noted at the start of our deep dive. The core problem is that the system seems designed to bypass the very people it's meant to serve.
Which leaves us with a final and I think provocative thought for you to consider long after we sign off. If the pursuit of a fully integrated European federation, this relentless push for deep political and fiscal unity, consistently requires the corruption of process, the circumvention of subsidiarity, and the destruction of democratic trust.
Then what?
Then should political efforts be refocused entirely on protecting and strengthening the one thing that is undeniably a profound historical and economic success, the European Economic Community and the internal market?
It's the ultimate question, isn't it? If the current trajectory continues, we risk losing the true, original success story of a continent at peace with open borders and trade, the foundation upon which everything else was built.
All in the pursuit of a political federation that seems incapable of functioning with democratic integrity.
That is the ultimate trade-off Europe has to face.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this extensive analysis gives you the insight you need to navigate these incredibly complex issues. We'll see you next time.